Welcome to the debate. You know, when the Soviet Union finally collapsed in December of 1991, the world didn't actually hear the blast of a nuclear bomb.
Right. There was no giant explosion.
Exactly. They didn't hear the rumble of invading tanks, and they didn't see massive armies clashing in the streets of Moscow. People literally just saw a flag being quietly lowered from the Kremlin.
Which is just wild to think about, considering the decades of tension before that.
It really is. And today, we're looking at a deeply fascinating, completely self-produced video analysis of this exact event. And I really want to emphasize this right at the top. The entire concept and design of this video were done by a creator named Hathoto Yoth.
Yeah, the design by Hathoto Yoth is just brilliant. It really makes the history accessible.
It does, and the video explores George Kennan's famous 1946 long telegram. For those who might not know, this was a secret 8,000-word message sent by a U.S. diplomat who was living in Moscow, sending it back to Washington, and it completely reshaped American foreign policy for nearly half a century.
Yeah, it basically became the playbook for the Cold War.
Exactly. And Hathoto's video essay brings up a really fundamental question about how global power actually works. So here is the core debate for today. Did the United States' active policy of, containment and relentless pressure actually cause the Soviet Union to fall? Or did the Soviet Union's own internal flaws and economic contradictions cause it to simply self-destruct naturally?
It's a huge question.
Okay, so to really understand this, I think we need to look closely at what the concept of containment actually looked like in practice, right? Especially as it's highlighted in Hatho through Suit's video design.
Yeah, let's unpack that.
Because this wasn't a passive waiting game. It wasn't the U.S. just sitting back and, watching the calendar turn. Containment was a highly forceful strategy.
Forceful, but not a direct war.
Right, no direct war, but the United States actively blocked the Soviet Empire's expansion and held a global line for over 40 years. By putting up a wall, diplomatically, economically, and militarily, the U.S. literally forced the Soviet Union to look inward.
Sure, they held the line.
But the source material is very specific here. It says this policy used relentless geopolitical pressure to suffocate the enemy. I really want us to think about that word, suffocate. Suffocation isn't something that just happens naturally in a vacuum. It is an action you take against someone.
Well, hold on a second.
Let me just finish this thought. By denying the Soviet Union access to new territories, new resources, and new global markets, the U.S. was actively cutting off their oxygen supply. This proves that what the video calls strategic patience wasn't just sitting around reading books. It was a direct, active weapon used to systematically topple an empire.
Okay, I understand why you see it as an active weapon. But honestly, that interpretation gives the United States way too much credit for a failure that was entirely Soviet.
You don't think 40 years of pressure deserves credit?
I think it played a role, but let's look at the actual source. Kennan was a brilliant diplomat, right? He was sitting right there in Moscow observing Stalin's regime up close. His core insight in that secret 8,000-word telegram, and later in his famous 1947 X article, was that this massive empire had a fatal flaw hidden deep inside.
Which it did.
Right. He saw that the Soviet system was mathematically and socially broken. I mean, think about it in simple terms. You have a centrally planned economy where, like a few guys in a government office try to decide exactly how many shoes, how many tractors, and how many loaves of bread an entire continent needs for the next 5 years.
It's impossible.
It's totally impossible. It's a system that punishes innovation and relies entirely on fear. Kennan knew their oppressive system was guaranteed to collapse under its own internal contradictions. The containment policy didn't destroy them. It simply kept the United States out of a devastating global war. As Hatho at Toot's video explicitly states, the Soviet Union suddenly self-destructed in December 1991. The disease was already inside the patient. We just kept our distance while it ran its terminal course.
Okay, I see the appeal of looking at it as an inevitable illness. It makes for a very clean narrative. But if we're talking about how these forces actually clashed in reality, we have to look at the mechanics of holding the line.
What do you mean by mechanics?
Well, You're framing containment as just a defensive shield, right? Like keeping a safe distance. But stopping a growing empire is actually a very active form of attack. Historically, empires need to grow to survive. They have to extract resources from new places to feed their massive armies and their economies.
Right, imperial expansion.
Exactly. Let me offer a way to visualize this. Imagine a massive, raging fire.
Okay.
If you build a tight, fireproof box around it to stop it from spreading, that box is actively killing the fire. The fire needs to expand to find fresh oxygen and fresh fuel. By building that tight box around the Soviet Union through, military alliances, economic embargoes, and proxy conflicts all over the globe, the U.S. strategy wasn't just self-defense. The box itself was the weapon designed to suffocate the enemy, just as the video design outlines. We actively starved the fire.
Okay, that fire analogy is vivid, I'll give you that. But I'm not convinced it accurately reflects the geopolitics at play here.
Why not?
Because a fire is a mindless natural force, right? It consumes oxygen based on simple physics. But the Soviet Union was a human-made system. It was built on specific laws, economies, and political ideologies. And the source material specifically uses the phrase suddenly self-destructed. Self-destruction fundamentally comes from the inside out.
But the box forced the self-destruction.
Let's look at a different structure. Instead of a fire, think of a house.
Okay, a house.
If a poorly built house falls down, you don't give the credit to the fence built around the property, do you?
Well, no.
Exactly. You blame the bad foundation and the cheap building materials. The Soviet Union was a terribly built house. The text tells us it had an oppressive system and that it collapsed under its own internal contradictions. That means the basic rules governing the country just didn't make sense. You can't promise absolute equality while simultaneously running a brutal police state that starves its own citizens.
Which is a huge contradiction. Yes.
Right. That contradiction was the real cause of the collapse. The fence, which is America's containment policy, just kept the neighbors safe when the roof finally caved in.
But let's think about the reality of that fence for a moment. It wasn't just sitting peacefully on the property line, minding its own business. The historical analysis we're exploring today tells us that containment guided U.S. policy for over 40 years using relentless geopolitical pressure.
Yes, pressure was applied.
Right, but let's break down those actual words. Relentless means it never stopped. It was every single day. Pressure means it was actively pushing inward. If we stick with your house analogy, the fence wasn't just standing there passively, it was constantly pushing against the structural walls of the house for 40 years.
Pushing how, exactly?
Through the arms race? We engaged in a massive global arms race. We built up our nuclear arsenals, forcing them to spend a huge percentage of their own wealth just to keep up with us. When you push against the weakened structure relentlessly for 40 years, and you force the owner to spend all their money on guard dogs instead of fixing their foundation, you are the one knocking it down. You are an active participant in its destruction.
I hear you. The pressure existed, absolutely. But the underlying intention of the policy really matters deeply here. The goal of containment, based on Kennan's original insight, was very simple. Don't fight the Soviets, just contain them.
But containing them was fighting them, just economically.
Not in the traditional sense. When Kennan published the X article under that mysterious pseudonym a year after sending the long telegram, he wasn't declaring a massive active war. He was suggesting something radically different for that time period in history. He was suggesting we literally just wait them out.
Wait them out while heavily armed?
Yes, but why wait? Because he knew the internal contradictions would eventually do the heavy lifting for us. If the goal was to aggressively knock the house down, as you say, we would have invaded. The goal of those 40 years of waiting wasn't destruction. The goal was simply to avoid a single spark of global war. The U.S. recognized that the Soviet Union was already carrying the seeds of its own destruction.
I'm just not convinced that avoiding a direct, total war means the U.S. wasn't actively destroying the enemy.
How so?
You can destroy an opponent without ever firing a gun directly at them. That's actually the whole brilliant point of Hathroth's video concept. The text calls the outcome a miraculous victory achieved without a single spark of a global war.
Yes, a miraculous victory.
But it is still explicitly called a victory. You don't achieve a victory unless you are actively competing in a struggle. By holding the line, the U.S. forced the Soviet Union to confront its own failures. They blocked expansion, which meant the Soviet government couldn't distract its people with new conquests.
That's true, they couldn't just keep adding territory.
Exactly. They forced the Soviet Union to look inward at its empty grocery store shelves and its failing factories. When you purposefully maneuver your opponent into a position where they have to face their own deadly flaws, you are the architect of their downfall.
Okay, but if the U.S. was the master architect here and this was a deliberate 40-year demolition project, then we really need to explain the reaction of the world when it finally happened.
What do you mean?
Let's look at the timeline presented in the source material. It says that in December 1991, the entire world stood in absolute shock.
Yeah, they were surprised.
But why were they shocked? I mean, if the United States had been systematically and predictably squeezing the life out of this empire, everyone should have seen the end coming from a mile away. You aren't shocked when a building collapses after you've been hitting the support beams with a wrecking ball for 4 decades.
Well,
The fact that the world stood in absolute shock shows that the sudden collapse was an internal surprise. The superpower looked invincible on the outside because of its massive military, but the internal gears simply shattered. It was a failure of their own machinery, their economy, their political faith, their social trust. It was not the final step of some predictable American attack.
Okay, that is a really fascinating way to interpret the word shock. But the historical context suggests the shock wasn't because the Soviet internal systems failed out of nowhere.
Then what was the shock about?
The shock was because the strategy of strategic patience actually worked perfectly, which is almost unheard of in world history.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Right? People were used to massive empires going down in flames. They were used to global conflicts ending with millions of casualties in ruined cities. They were shocked that a secret 8,000-word telegram from a diplomat could actually serve as the blueprint for a 40-year weapon that dismantled a superpower peacefully. The shock was the sheer effectiveness of the containment strategy.
That's an interesting angle.
And this brings us to exactly how we should interpret the video's conclusion. The video claims that 1991 is history's ultimate proof of how strategic patience can topple an empire. I really want to highlight the word topple.
Topple.
Yes. Patience in this context is an active force. It does the toppling. The video doesn't say patience allows an empire to fall. It says patience can topple it. That framing implies that the act of holding the line and applying relentless geopolitical pressure was the physical force pushing the empire over the cliff.
I hear you, but I think leaning too hard on the word topple ignores the broader context of what George Kennan was actually doing. Let's look at another critical word in the text, prophecy.
Okay?
The source says, Cannan's prophecy from 45 years prior had officially come true. Now, think about what a prophet actually is.
Someone who sees the future.
Right. A prophet doesn't make the rain fall. A prophet just understands the weather patterns well enough to tell you a storm is coming. Kennan predicted their failure. He didn't engineer it. The text clearly outlines his thought process. He asked, if forced to stop expanding and look inward, what would happen?
And his answer was they'd collapse.
Exactly. His answer was that their oppressive system would collapse under its own internal contradictions. He was diagnosing a fatal flaw, not inventing it. The miraculous victory wasn't that the U.S. managed to destroy the Soviet Union. The miracle was that the U.S. managed to keep the peace, hold its ground, and avoid a nuclear holocaust while the Soviet Union inevitably succumbed to its own internal rot.
Okay, diagnosing a fatal flaw is one thing. But Kennan didn't just write down a prediction on a napkin and file it away. He wrote an 8,000-word telegram to Washington.
Right, it was massive.
You don't write 8,000 words just to say, hey, they're going to fail eventually. Let's just sit back and watch. You write 8,000 words to explain exactly how to exploit that fatal flaw. Let's go back to your idea of diagnosing an illness.
Okay.
If a doctor knows a patient has a terminal condition and that doctor then designs a complex 40-year treatment plan specifically designed to accelerate that condition, by cutting off the patient's access to external remedies, well, that doctor is actively participating in the outcome.
You're saying containment was the treatment plan.
Absolutely. By saying the U.S. must block their expansion, Kennan was prescribing an active geopolitical treatment. He wasn't just predicting the rain, he was explaining how to seed the clouds. He provided an instruction manual for applying relentless pressure to ensure the Soviet system couldn't escape its own contradictions.
The length of the telegram is definitely significant. I won't argue that. But we have to ask what those 8,000 words were actually about. They were a deep dive into Russian history, Soviet psychology, and Marxist ideology.
True.
They were spent explaining why the Soviet Union behaved the way it did and why it was fatally flawed. The text highlights his core insights. He saw the fatal flaw hidden deep inside the massive empire. That is an observation of a pre-existing condition. Let's think about it like a high-speed car race.
Okay, I like a good car analogy.
If you are racing against a car that you know has a cracked engine block, and you decide your best strategy is just to stay on the track and keep driving safely until their engine inevitably blows up, you didn't destroy their car.
But you forced them to keep racing.
You just smartly realized the car would destroy itself if forced to keep running at that speed. The internal contradictions, the lack of basic freedoms, the failing agriculture, the massive corruption, those cracks were already in the engine block.
But the text also explicitly says, if forced to stop expanding and look inward. That word forced is the whole game here. Who is doing the forcing?
Well, the containment policy.
Exactly. The United States policy of containment. If the U.S. had not forced them to stop expanding, perhaps the Soviet Union could have found a way to resolve or delay its internal contradictions. Maybe they could have constantly taken over new territory, consuming new resources, new factories, and new populations to keep their broken economic engine running a little longer.
I just don't see that happening.
But by holding the line, the U.S. denied them that lifeline. We forced the fatal flaw to become fatal. The active pressure of containment is what made the internal collapse an inevitability.
I hear your point, but I just don't believe any amount of external expansion could have saved the Soviet system in the long run. An oppressive system that fundamentally ignores human nature and basic economics will always collapse eventually, regardless of outside forces.
You think it was inevitable, no matter what?
I do. You just can't run a modern complex society through pure fear and central dictation. It's a fundamental law of how societies function. The massive empire was seemingly invincible on the outside because of its nuclear weapons, but it was hollow on the inside. Containment didn't cause the collapse. It was just the necessary boundary to ensure their rotten structure didn't cause a global catastrophe when it finally fell apart.
We have really dug into the mechanics of this history today. We've explored exactly how containment operated, the real-world implications of Kennan's long telegram, and the friction between external pressure and internal failure.
It's a lot to think about.
It really is. So as we wrap up, let's make sure we distill our positions down so they are crystal clear, for an 8th grader to understand. I'll summarize my perspective first.
Go for it.
The United States did not just sit back and watch history unfold like a passive audience member. By actively blocking Soviet expansion and applying constant, relentless geopolitical pressure for over 40 years, the U.S. forced the empire into a tight box. They cut off the oxygen, engaged in massive arms races, and forced the Soviet Union to look inward at its own failures until it suffocated. Strategic patience was not just waiting around, it was a powerful, active tool that directly toppled a massive empire.
And my summary is this. The Soviet system was mathematically and fundamentally broken from the very start. It was a poorly built house with a fatal structural flaw. The economy just couldn't provide for its people, and the government relied on oppression. By holding the defensive line and simply avoiding a terrible, catastrophic global war, the U.S. allowed the empire's own oppressive rules and internal contradictions to naturally destroy it from the inside out. We didn't knock it down. It suddenly and inevitably self-destructed.
Despite our different views on exactly what drove the collapse, I think there is a very clear point of agreement between us here.
Oh, absolutely.
We both recognize that George Kennan's 1946 telegram was just a monumental work of historical insight. It completely reshaped American foreign policy, shifting the world away from direct military confrontation, and it ultimately resulted in a miraculous victory where the globe avoided a Third World War.
I'm completely with you on that. Keeping the world safe from a global nuclear war for 40 years while a massive, heavily armed superpower self-destructs is undeniably a miraculous victory. It really shows the immense value of looking at history through multiple perspectives.
Yeah, it really does.
Because understanding the exact mechanics of how massive global conflicts end is incredibly complex. It requires us to look at both the outside pressure and the inside reality.
Exactly. And that is why these self-produced video analysis we talk about today provides such a brilliant starting point for this discussion. Again, the concept and design by Hatho Theothuth really force us to ask hard questions about how power works on a global scale. It shows us that you don't always need explosives, wrecking balls, or invading armies to bring down a giant structure.
Yeah, sometimes the quietest strategies, like simply waiting for bad math to catch up with a bad system, have the loudest impacts on human history.
Well said. We aren't going to declare a winner today. We want to leave it up to you, the listener, to decide which force truly ended the Cold War.
Was it the active, relentless outside pressure suffocating the fire? Or was it the poorly built house collapsing under its own weight?
It's definitely something to think about the next time you see a massive structure, whether it's a towering building or a global empire, and you wonder what actually holds it together and what might finally bring it down. Thank you for listening.